coming to our session today. I want to thank Evan Smith for being with us today. He's a co-founder and CEO of Altana. And for those of you who don't know, Altana has the largest body of organized supply chain data in the world. So we're talking to somebody who's a true expert here today. You know, Evan, we were preparing for this, and we're going to talk about mastering the value chain in an era of global upheaval. Could we have picked a better day or what? I mean, this is the day. So I went back, Evan, and looked at just board topics. There's so much uncertainty as we put together our plans for FY25, and every company that I'm involved with, certainly. And there were so many areas of uncertainty. There were tariffs. There were geopolitical tensions between all the major powers. There were tax policies and Pillar 2 and all of those issues. There was, the China Plus strategy for some companies. Some went to India, some went to Vietnam, some went to Mexico. Those that went to Mexico probably need a China Plus 2 policy today. We have data security and cybersecurity, concerns, and certainly the regulatory environment, both in the U.S., the states, the federal, as well as abroad, has been a real challenge for companies as they've thought through it. So scenario planning has never taken on a greater meaning than it does today. So I thought we'd start with the topic of the day, which is tariffs. What is in everybody's mind. So first of all, as you're sitting in boardrooms, what questions are people asking you, and what types of solutions are you coming up with that can help people in this area?
You just went through most of them. So if the board's kind of top-level function is to manage risk, then if you look around at the major categories of risk today, most of them have their intersection in the supply chain, which is where we spend our time. And specifically to tariffs, I think a lot of people took Trump seriously, but not literally in the last administration, and now you might actually take him literally. We've launched a tariff simulation capability. So I'll back up and explain what we do. So we think about it as like Google Maps for the whole global supply chain. We light up that entire network. We have an AI model that tells you different insights about the network. We can automate different parts of some of these use cases. But for the enterprise, which is kind of how we're having the conversation today, the fundamental experience we offer is we help you to illuminate and manage your extended global value chains. So where do your raw materials come from? Where do your intermediates come from? And how are they assembled? How do those turn into final products that then get to you, that then get to your customers? That whole chain is called your value chain. And in an era of globalization and outsourcing, you weren't supposed to know the answer to that question. Like, who are my suppliers' suppliers, right? Like the whole point was to push that out and find the most efficient source of production. So now that all flips around these geopolitical dimensions, around these climate dimensions, around these COVID and kind of resilience concerns. And a lot of this is turning into policy, of which tariffs are a subset. If you look, I think the IMF said last year there were 1,200 net new economic security and trade intervention policies introduced in the world. This year, I don't even know what the count would be over the first 2 months of this year, but I'm sure we're already getting close. And this reverses a multi-decade trend of free trade and trade liberalization, right?
Right.
And so, back to tariffs. So we have the ability for an enterprise to, literally push buttons and simulate the question of, okay, how do tariffs on these countries at these rates impact me directly? But then where it gets much more interesting is we can then look across that multi-tier network and say, okay, if the intermediate products are still coming into Mexico to be assembled, then with the new derivative framework on the tariffs, those things still hit, right? So if it's Chinese intermediates being assembled in Mexico, you still have the problem, and this is your China +1, +2 kind of thing. So we're not only simulating the impact of tariffs, but we can then give the C-suite, the board, the ability to say, okay, what if we modified these inputs at these locations in our value chain with these supplier relationships? What then? And then you model that out. And then we further give them the ability to look across that entire map of the world and find alternative suppliers that optimize for whatever those scenarios they're trying to adapt to. So we're in a really unique position to bring not just the kind of visibility to say like what is the network, but then the intelligence to say what might I do about it.
How many inputs would you have in in that analysis? Like, if the company came to you and said, Evan, I really want to study my value chain end to end, certainly in this era of all of this going on with tariffs, geopolitical tensions, et cetera, how many inputs would they need to provide to you to do a proper job of that type of?
They give us a data dump and then we do the rest. So we hook into like the ERP system or the supplier management system or what's called a PLM, a product lifecycle management. So we're basically taking the goods that enterprise makes or sells, the companies that it does business with directly. Like I have customers on one side of my business, I have suppliers on the other. We ingest that and then we light it up in the platform. And then now you see the tier 2, then the tier 3, the tier 4, the tier 5. You can go in and trace it, validate it, annotate it. And today we can actually allow them to collaborate across that multi-tier network. So the big idea for us is how do we start to we think about it as like virtual vertical integration.
Okay.
So vertical integration was when you sort of owned the entire value chain, right? Like Ford used to own rubber plantations in Brazil to make the tires, to make the cars.
Right.
And then we outsourced and we don't do that anymore, SpaceX notwithstanding. So is there a way to actually like light up that whole chain, manage it, coordinate across it without having to literally own it like you used to?
So what do you do? I mean, if you have the world's largest organized data for supply chain, how do you utilize that data to support it?
So backing up, what we did when we started the company was we said, we want to build this supply chain common operating picture that everybody taps into. And what you pretty quickly realize, and this was the founding thesis, is that none of these large data holders like a Maersk or a UPS or a Walmart want to contribute their data into some centralized pool. Governments, we don't even get me started. So what we said was, let's create a federated data model where we embrace the siloed nature of the data. So it's a hub and spoke network where in the hub, we're getting all of the publicly available data, all the commercially licensable, purchasable data that we can get. And we have our own homegrown AI systems that we built up over the years that stitch all that data together, clean it across billions of records, and then produce a LinkedIn or Facebook style knowledge graph of all the companies in the world, their ownership structures, where they do business, what the nature of those operations are, and then most importantly, what the movement of goods are between them and what are the nature of those goods. We then connect our customers into that map of the world in their own kind of private enclaves. And we're taking the thumbprints of those data sets. So there's a data flywheel and an AI flywheel that underpins the whole business. We are not sharing everybody's data with each other. What we are doing is we're building out network visibility from their data.
Okay.
And we're training AI on their data. So you give a little, you get a lot. You're tapping into this common operating picture with the US regulators on commerce and customs. You're tapping into a common operating picture with your upstream supply chain. You're tapping into a common operating picture with your logistics provider. So that's the virtuous cycle that underpins the whole business.
Maybe we'll shift for a minute and talk a little bit about regulations. And, that's becoming just an incredibly complicated picture. I've just sat through 4 different presentations from different companies on how they're dealing with these regulations around the world. And in the States, they're just so unusual even within the States. So what are your thoughts on helping companies and helping even governments in dealing with?
Yeah, we're on both sides of the coin, so I'm super conflicted. But that was the big idea for the company, was we can actually create a bridge between the public and private sectors. And if you have that common operating picture, you can then also imagine workflows and use cases where you connect the two into a collaborative use case. So we're literally doing that now. We're going to do a press release in a little bit, but
Here we go.
Yeah, here we go. We're literally doing that now in the context of U.S. imports. So we're creating like a TSA pre-check, global entry for cargo in partnership with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So that's a scenario where, the regulations created a ton of pain on the importing community. The regulations I'm talking about are, over the last couple of years, there's been a huge trend in U.S. border policy toward making the importer responsible for not just what they do themselves in terms of, are my goods properly classified? Am I paying the duties? Is there an FDA certificate I need to give here or there? Is it safe? Now these regulations are saying everything that happens upstream of you, right, in the raw materials, the cotton that came from the ground in Xinjiang, China, is presumed guilty until you can prove it innocent of forced labor, for example. So they've really created this incredible new burden on the private sector to say, you're responsible for what happens indirectly in your value chain. So we're helping the private sector to comply with those laws. We're helping the public sector to enforce those laws. And now we've created the bridge between the two in this context of trade facilitation. So I think the opportunity here, and I met with some of the National Security Council and the new administration a couple of weeks ago, and we talked to them about literally this and said, look, I think this is the have cake, eat two solution where you can use the border, you can use export controls, you can use these kind of economic security and trade policies to effectively achieve your geopolitical agenda through the use of border enforcements and regulations, that's what's happening, right? And you can do that without destroying the economy, and you can do that without penalizing the American businesses that want to be hygienic, that are doing the right thing, that are showing their homework. That same meeting I had, he told me that the Trump transition team in the National Security Council and kind of the policy shop, they were told that one of the headline goals of the administration is to be able to completely decouple U.S. critical industries from China within 4 years. So this is the direction of travel. I mean, to some extent, we help to make that possible, right? One of our customers is, I'm not going to name the name because it's a sensitive thing, but Fortune 50 company, massive name brand tech business, and for the last 5 years, every single board meeting, their lead director told me this. Every single board meeting they've had, they've asked the same two questions. What's our exposure to China and our supply chain?
Yep.
And where are we single-threaded, where we have a single supplier, a sole source supplier, or a choke point that runs through China in our supply chain? And that company couldn't answer that question until about 3 months ago, working with us. So I think you've got to start with the facts, and then you can move to the solutions.
So if you were advising a board today on what are the questions that they should be asking, given everything that's going on and given everything that you know based on all the work that you're doing, what are the questions that you would say boards should be asking and why?
That's a big one, right? So value judgments aside, politics aside, just kind of observing the system. I think Cold War II is upon us, right? So there's a great power conflict that's playing out in the supply chain, and it's going to show up in terms of policies like the ones I was describing. It's going to show up in terms of the tariffs. It's going to show up in terms of export controls, right? This is going to get worse, not better. So if you're on a board and you have a physical supply chain that runs through China and you're in a critical industry, you should be preparing for that decoupling because, it's a stated policy objective to achieve that decoupling. In the other direction, supply chains run in both directions, right? Some of my customer's
Right.
customer. You saw that Chinese retaliation today, which was, okay, we're going to curb market access for these products. We're going to start to sanction these U.S. companies. They've already restricted critical mineral exports and raised prices. And so I think if you just look at that as like a mega trend, I think you should be betting on that mega trend to persist. And Trump talks about wanting a big deal, but these are the gears of history turning. So that's probably the big one. I think that the climate stuff hasn't gone away. So there's in the EU they had the last kind of EU government had the Green Deal. So it was a 4-year run, and they had the Green Deal, and it was 5 pieces of regulation that told the private sector, you're now accountable for the environmental and social impacts of not just your business, but everything that happens, again, in your value chain. So your raw materials, the intermediates, that whole network. A lot of that's being softened and clawed back in the name of easing the burden on business, spurring growth, and not falling behind in this multipolar economic and security arms race. So they haven't gone away. They won't go away, and the climate is still changing, and you're still seeing major catastrophes. So again, if you're like, if your job is to manage risk across a global footprint, you tell me, but it seems like that's going up, not down.
100%.
Yeah. And then the question I would be asking is like, what are the have cake eat too solutions here? So can I talk about this? We're working with a top 3 logistics provider. They are reasonably worried about fentanyl, tariffs, counterfeits, e-commerce being the bludgeon that the administration uses to basically conscript the logistics sector into the compliance effort in the same way that they did to the banks after 9/11. So our partner, our customer, is working with us to get ahead of that, and we're going voluntarily to the White House together, and we're saying, what would it look like to build a trusted network? So if we partner with Altana, if we screen all of our shipments, if we use the same technology you're doing to enforce these laws and target fentanyl and fentanyl precursors and forced labor and dumping and all the rest, if we apply that to our entire global logistics network, what benefit can we get, right? So that's a question I would be asking as a board, is like, how do we kind of get out of the defensive reactive mode and go into the proactive mode where we're sort of adapting to the times?
And if you're a company that's just starting to build its supply chain and thinking about what it should do, what advice would you give that company?
Oh boy. Yeah, I would. It's funny. We're doing some deals now with some of the new like defense tech unicorns.
Yep.
And same deal. A lot of those electronic components come straight from China, and they know it. Everybody knows it. So I think if you're starting a supply chain on something that's sort of deemed critical, people talk about like critical industries. So it's advanced electronics, it's pharmaceuticals, it's food, it's aerospace, defense, and so forth. I would be really focused on how do I have a sort of end-to-end AI-driven, design through sourcing, through order execution, through inventory positioning. Like if I were starting from scratch, I would be AI-centric from the design phase to the execution phase. I would also be as local as possible. And, I think Tom Friedman got it all wrong, where free trade created peace. I think it was literally the other way around. I think peace created the conditions for free trade, and we've seen that pattern play out over the centuries. And we're now in an era of geopolitical disequilibrium. And when there is disequilibrium, there's conflict and trade declines, there's impacts to growth. So if you're starting a company in the West, I would orient my supply chain toward the West and value chain relationships that are Western aligned. And I would weather what'll probably be a few decades storm.
Wow. And what would you, so there are people out here who are either on startup boards or advising startups or are startups. And you certainly have been I think you've been a co-founder at least a couple of times already. What advice would you give just generally to these startup businesses? What have you learned? What are the things that, you'd like to impart from all the work that you've done?
On supply chain or just anything?
I want you to talk about anything now. I'm going to switch a little bit in the last few minutes and just, because we try to do this at the end of these sessions.
Yeah, look,
given our audience.
The big lesson I've learned, so I've mostly failed. I started my first company when I was 22. that failed. I started another one that got somewhere, then failed. I had a base hit, and then Altana has been great so far. When it started to really work for me, I learned the lesson of alignment and of seeking and communicating reality in service of alignment. So what I mean by that is, like, you kind of starting a business, there's an inherent tension between vision and reality. That's the whole point. And the entrepreneurial journey is, how can I bring reality to vision? And one way or another, that tension is going to resolve itself. And there's something like psychologically and culturally that I've learned that's really important, which is you've got to constantly be seeking and communicating and surfacing reality with all your stakeholders, recognizing that you're trying to change reality as you go. And that gets you through the good times and the bad times, and especially the bad times. So it brings your board into, and your investors into alignment with you on the stuff that's not working. You're on the same side of the table, you're working through those problems together. It can help bring your employees and your partners through that. I always, when I meet with customers, what do you hate about our product? How can we do this better, right? Like, I don't want to be flattered, like, right? And having that orientation toward truth, recognizing you don't have a claim on it, that's been the biggest breakthrough for me. And as I've applied that and internalized it, I've had a lot more success.
I think transparency is key in all those relationships, for sure. Is there anything else that you want to impart upon this audience about thinking about the journey and where you are today with this company, and how you would maybe do things differently if you had it to do all over again? And let's help them grow some businesses out there.
If I had it to do all over again, this is the dream job for me. Like, literally, I get to inhabit the thing I am preoccupied with in my brain all the time. So I don't know that I would do anything differently. I had 2 co-founders. They've changed roles. We've had to go through those evolutions. That's normal. I think honestly, when we started the company, we wrote down, how do we think the world is going to change, and how do we want to go through that?
I'd like to read that first version.
I reread it. I reread it about 6 months ago, and most of the things came true. We didn't call COVID, but we said, this just-in-time supply chain thing's going to be super fragile. Everything else has come true, and I think we're building the business to surf these waves.
So, we had this conversation in a number of different forums around how often strategy has to change today. And I think John Chambers even asked you, Mesh, the question in the last session. How often companies have to change strategy now because of what's happening in the world, because of what's happening with AI, how fast things are moving from a technology standpoint. How often are you guys changing strategy? Is this like an iterative, interactive thing for strategy?
The strategy, I think about it as like we have a compass bearing, and then if you actually zoom in, it just looks like this along the way. Tariffs are a great example. So, we had the capability, we had some dashboards spun up, we had John Deere using some of the tariff simulation things we did. The news hits. This was, the beginning of the year. And within 4 days, we were in market with a solution. I think we closed 4 deals on tariffs last week. So there's so much surface area.
You'll probably be doing more real soon.
I hope so. So there's a lot of surface area in the thing that we built that allows you to kind of compensate in one direction when something else isn't working. Last year, our government business was a disaster. There was no new money going through the system. Right. Everything was on a continuing resolution. And we just totally whiffed on government, but our enterprise business tripled. So whether it's COVID or trade war or the climate stuff, like these kind of topics du jour all kind of compensate for each other. And
that's great. Well, I think we want to thank Evan for taking the time to talk to us today. This is a complicated topic. We're all dealing with it. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.